Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. I am so pumped for this one. We're going to be talking about critical race theory today, specifically how it's used in discourse analysis. And I got to say, I've been just devouring all these articles from the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit website to prep for this. And whoa, it is eye-opening stuff.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much language shapes our understanding of race, you know, like without us even realizing it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see those connections, right? Because it's not just like blatant hate speech or anything. It's like the subtle ways that like everyday conversations and the things we see in the media, can actually be perpetuating systems of inequality that we might not even be aware of.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the weeds here, let's just take a step back and make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly is critical race theory? Like, what's the core idea? And then how does that relate to discourse analysis?
So at its heart, critical race theory, or CRT, it challenges that idea that racism is just about individual prejudice, right? Like just bad apples. Instead, it argues that racism is actually like deeply embedded in societal structures. So we're talking about laws, policies, even language itself. And so CRT in discourse analysis, that's where we look at how those structures shape our understanding of race and, how it plays out in those dynamics, often in ways that are super subtle.
So instead of looking at like isolated incidents, it's about the whole system, right?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still a bit fuzzy on how race, if it's not biological, is actually created through discourse.
So think of it this way. Race is a social construct. It's not about inherent biological differences between people. It's about the meanings and categories that we as a society have created and then reinforced over time. And language is one of the main ways that we do that.
Okay, hold on. I think I need an example here. Like, how does that actually work?
Sure. So think about how policies are worded, right? Or media portrayals, or even just casual conversations that we have. All of those things can reinforce racial stereotypes or hierarchies without even meaning to. One of the articles I was reading for this deep dive, it talked about how news coverage of crime often links certain races with criminality, even if it never explicitly says that.
Whoa. Yeah, that's so subtle. But it's got to have a huge impact over time.
Yeah.
In the source material, there were all these different frameworks within CRT that kept popping up. Things like racial formation theory, whiteness is property, and intersectionality. Can we unpack those a bit?
Absolutely. So each of those frameworks provides a different lens for understanding how race operates in society. So for example, racial formation theory, that was developed by Michael Omi and Howard Winant, and it explains how racial categories are created, transformed, and destroyed over time. And they argue that this happens through social, economic, and political forces that create what they call racial projects, which are essentially efforts to give meaning to race and then link it to social structures.
Okay, I'm with you so far. So like using that theory, would things like affirmative action policies or even something like the war on drugs be considered racial projects?
Yeah, that's a great example because those are things that definitely shape how we understand and talk about race in America. Even if they didn't explicitly set out to do that, it's about analyzing how those initiatives impact racial categories and hierarchies, right?
Okay, that's making things a lot clearer. Now, what about whiteness as property? That one really caught my eye.
Yeah.
But it's also a bit provocative.
It is a powerful concept. It can be tough to wrap your head around. The idea, which comes from legal scholar Cheryl Harris, is that whiteness has historically been treated as a form of property in the United States, just like owning land or possessions. Being categorized as white has granted tangible and intangible benefits, advantages.
You mean like access to better education, housing, jobs?
Exactly. And it goes even beyond that. So think about social and cultural capital. Things like being perceived as more trustworthy or credible or deserving of respect. Those are things that often come with being seen as white, even if they're not explicitly stated.
That makes me think about how some people might bristle at this concept. They might say, well, I worked hard for everything I have. It's not because I'm white. How does CRT address that kind of pushback?
It's a valid question, and it really highlights how deeply ingrained these systems are. CRT doesn't deny that individuals, work hard or that effort matters. Instead, it argues that those efforts often happen within a system that's already tilted in favor of certain groups. It's like starting a race where some runners are given a head start. Their individual speed and effort still matter, of course, but the playing field isn't level.
That's a great analogy. It makes it much more concrete.
Now, we can't talk about CRT without addressing intersectionality, which you mentioned earlier. This concept was developed by Kimberlé Crenshaw, and it argues that people experience oppression and privilege based on the intersection of their various identities. So we're talking race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and so on.
So it's not enough to just look at race in isolation.
Right.
We have to consider how it interacts with all these other parts of a person's identity.
Exactly. Intersectionality challenges us to move beyond those single-axis frameworks and acknowledge the complexity of how these identities overlap to create unique experiences of oppression and privilege. For example, a Black woman might experience discrimination differently than a Black man or a white woman, because her experience is shaped by both her race and gender.
It seems like intersectionality is a key part of making discourse analysis more nuanced and accurate.
Absolutely. Without it, our analysis would miss those really crucial points where different forms of oppression come together and create specific lived experiences.
All this talk about frameworks is fascinating, but I'm curious, how do we actually apply all this to the analysis of discourse? Like, what are the methods that researchers actually use to dig into this stuff?
That's a great question, and that's where things get really interesting. There are a variety of methods used in CRT discourse analysis, each with its own strengths and limitations. One of the most common is Critical Discourse Analysis, or CDA.
Okay, break that down for me. What makes CDA so special?
So CDA focuses on uncovering the hidden ideologies and power dynamics that are embedded within texts. It goes beyond just describing what's being said and delves into how language is used to create meaning-shaped perceptions and even justify inequality.
So it's like reading between the lines, looking for those subtle cues that reveal the author's underlying assumptions and biases.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So imagine you're analyzing a politician's speech about immigration. CDA would prompt you to ask questions like, what are the underlying assumptions about immigrants in this speech? Whose voices are being amplified and whose are being silenced? Or, what are the potential social and political consequences of this particular framing of the issue?
Wow. I can already see how CDA would be incredibly useful for analyzing things like news articles, political speeches, even social media posts. It's like a whole new way of understanding the messages we're bombarded with every day.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool for understanding how language shapes our world and for challenging those discourses that perpetuate inequality.
This is all so fascinating. I feel like I'm learning a whole new vocabulary for understanding how race and power operate.
That's the beauty of discourse analysis. It gives us this new set of lenses for decoding the messages that we encounter and for really critically examining those often hidden ideologies that shape our perceptions. But there are other methods besides CDA, of course.
Oh, tell me more. What other tools are out there for analyzing discourse through a CRT lens?
Well, one that comes to mind is Ethnography of Communication. This approach is all about immersing yourself in a particular community or context to observe how people use language in their everyday interactions.
So instead of analyzing written texts, we're looking at spoken language and social interactions.
Right. Imagine you're interested in studying racial dynamics in a particular workplace. Using ethnography of communication, you might spend time observing how people talk about race, how they address each other, or even how they use nonverbal cues to express racial biases.
It's like becoming a fly on the wall to see how these subtle interactions can actually reinforce those larger systems of racial inequality.
Exactly. And those observations can provide valuable insights into how racism operates at the interpersonal level and how those seemingly small interactions can have big impacts on perpetuating those hierarchies.
Okay, so we've got CDA for analyzing texts and ethnography of communication for understanding real-world interactions. Are there any other key methodologies we should know about?
There are actually quite a few, each with its own focus and application. But before we dive into those, I'm curious, what stood out to you so far in this initial exploration of CRT and discourse analysis?
Honestly, it's the sheer scope of it all that's blowing my mind. I never realized how deeply language is intertwined with power and inequality. It's like suddenly seeing those invisible strings that connect our words to these larger systems of oppression.
I think that's a common reaction. It can be overwhelming at first, but it's also incredibly empowering. Once you start to see those connections, you can start to challenge them.
That's a great point. It's not just about understanding the problem. It's about finding ways to actually dismantle these systems and create a more just and equitable world. But I have to admit, I'm also feeling a bit cautious. How do we avoid reinforcing those harmful stereotypes when we're analyzing them? It seems like such a tricky balancing act.
That's an excellent point. And it leads us to some of the critiques of CRT that we should definitely explore.
You know, before we jump into that, I do want to hear about those other methodologies you mentioned.
Of course, there's so much more to uncover, and each method offers a unique perspective on how language shapes our understanding of race and racism. But maybe we can save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
That sounds like a plan. We've already covered so much ground, and I have a feeling this conversation is just getting started.
I completely agree. There's so much more to explore, and I'm eager to see where this conversation takes us.
Okay, so before we went to the break, we were starting to touch on some of the critiques of critical race theory. It seems like anytime race is discussed, things can get a little heated.
Yeah, that's true. And CRT has definitely been a target of some pretty intense criticism lately. But, I think it's important to remember that critique and debate are essential parts of any academic field.
Right?
It helps us refine our thinking and make sure that our analysis is as rigorous and nuanced as possible.
Okay, so what are some of the most common criticisms that are leveled at CRT? The article has mentioned something about essentialism.
Yes, that's one of the big ones. The essentialism critique argues that by focusing so heavily on race, CRT might unintentionally reinforce the idea that race is this, essential biological category rather than a social construct.
So it's like we're saying, look how different these racial groups are, which could actually strengthen those harmful categories that we're trying to break down.
Exactly, and it's a valid concern. CRT scholars are very aware of this potential pitfall, and they take great care to emphasize that their goal is not to reify those racial categories, but to analyze how those categories are used to create and maintain systems of power and inequality.
So it's not about saying that race is inherently meaningful, but rather about analyzing how it's made meaningful through social, political, and economic forces, which, if I'm being honest, is a pretty mind-blowing concept.
It really is, and it's why discourse analysis is so important in this context, because by carefully examining the language that's used in various contexts, we can start to reveal those hidden assumptions about race and challenge the ways in which those assumptions shape our understanding of the world.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still wondering, how do researchers actually navigate that tricky balance between analyzing race without reinforcing those essentialist ideas?
One key strategy is to consistently incorporate intersectionality into their analyses. So by acknowledging the multiple and overlapping identities that individuals hold, researchers can avoid treating race as like a monolithic or static category.
So instead of just looking at race in a vacuum, we're always considering how it intersects with gender, class, sexual orientation, and all these other factors.
Exactly. Another important approach is reflexivity. So this means being constantly aware of your own biases and assumptions as a researcher and how those might influence your analysis.
You mean like acknowledging that you might have blind spots based on your own lived experiences and identities?
Precisely. It's about constantly checking your own perspective and being open to the possibility that you might not be seeing the whole picture. And that's especially important when you're dealing with a complex and sensitive topic like race.
I can definitely see how that would be crucial. Okay, so we've talked about the essentialism critique. Are there any other major criticisms of CRT that we should be aware of?
There are a few others, but I think one of the most prominent is the idea that CRT focuses too much on the past and not enough on the present or the future. So critics argue that it can make people feel guilty or ashamed of their history without offering any practical solutions for moving forward.
So it's like getting stuck in the past, dwelling on those historical injustices without acknowledging progress or offering a path toward reconciliation.
That's one way to put it. And I think it's important to address this critique. While CRT does examine historical patterns of racism, its ultimate goal is to understand how those patterns continue to shape the present and to inform strategies for creating a more just and equitable future.
So it's not just about dwelling on the past. It's about using that understanding of the past to create positive change in the present and the future.
Exactly. It's about identifying those persistent structures of inequality and then working to dismantle them.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've talked about two major criticisms of CRT. The essentialism critique and the focus on the past critique. Are there any others that come up frequently?
Another one that often comes up is the argument that CRT is divisive and that it promotes resentment between racial groups. So critics worry that by focusing on racial disparities and injustices, CRT might actually exacerbate tensions rather than foster understanding and unity.
I can see how people might have that concern, especially in our current political climate where things feel so polarized. But isn't it important to acknowledge those disparities and injustices if we ever want to actually address them?
That's the heart of the debate, isn't it? CRT scholars argue that ignoring those issues doesn't make them go away. It just allows them to fester and continue to cause harm. They believe that open and honest dialogue about race, even if it's uncomfortable at times, is necessary for achieving true racial justice.
So it's about confronting those uncomfortable truths, even if they challenge our existing beliefs or make us question our own complicity in these systems of oppression.
Precisely. It's about being willing to have those difficult conversations and to do the hard work of dismantling those structures of inequality that have been in place for far too long.
I'm starting to see how even the critiques of CRT can lead to some really productive discussions. It's like they push us to think more deeply about these issues and to refine our understanding of how race and racism operate in our society.
I completely agree. Engaging with those critiques, even if we don't fully agree with them, helps us to strengthen our arguments, to consider alternative perspectives, and to ultimately develop a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of how CRT can be applied to the study of discourse.
Okay, so we've covered some of the key critiques of CRT, but I'm also curious about the practical side of things.
Yeah.
What are some real-world examples of how CRT is being used in discourse analysis?
There are tons of fascinating examples out there, from analyzing media representations of race to examining the language used in legal decisions and policy documents.
Okay, I need specifics. Can you walk me through like a real-world case study that demonstrates how CRT can shed light on a particular issue or event?
Absolutely. One of the most well-known examples comes from the work of Kimberlé Crenshaw, who we discussed earlier. She analyzed legal cases involving Black women who had experienced discrimination. And she found that these women were often denied justice because the legal system couldn't adequately address the ways in which they were discriminated against based on both their race and their gender.
It's like those legal frameworks were set up to deal with either race or gender, but not both at the same time.
Exactly. So these women were falling through the cracks of the system because their experiences didn't fit neatly into those pre-existing categories. And so Crenshaw argued that the law needed to recognize how race and gender intersect to create unique forms of oppression. And her work has had a profound impact on both legal scholarship and social justice movements.
That's a powerful example of how CRT can help us see those blind spots in existing systems and advocate for more inclusive and equitable frameworks.
Absolutely. Another case study that really highlights the power of CRT discourse analysis involves the work of scholar Robin DiAngelo, particularly her concept of white fragility.
Oh yeah, I've heard that term thrown around a lot lately, but I'm not sure I fully grasp what it means.
So DiAngelo argues that white people often have a very low tolerance for discussions about race and racism. They become defensive or shut down when confronted with their own privilege or complicity in those systems, which makes it really difficult to have those productive conversations about racial justice.
So it's like a kind of defensiveness or resistance that arises when white people are challenged on issues of race.
Exactly. And DiAngelo argues that this fragility is a product of white supremacy. It's a way of maintaining those power dynamics and avoiding accountability. And so by analyzing the language and behaviors associated with white fragility, we can start to understand how it functions as a barrier to racial progress.
This is giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
I can see how understanding white fragility would be crucial for anyone who wants to engage in meaningful dialogue about race.
I agree. It's a concept that has really helped to illuminate those subtle ways in which white supremacy operates and how we can begin to dismantle those defense mechanisms that prevent us from having those honest and necessary conversations.
Okay, so we've seen how CRT can be applied to legal cases and to the concept of white fragility. Are there any other case studies that demonstrate its real-world applications?
Definitely. There's a really interesting example from the field of education. Scholars have used CRT to analyze textbooks and curriculum materials, revealing how those materials often perpetuate Eurocentric perspectives and whitewash history.
So it's like looking at those hidden messages in the stories we tell our children and how those stories might reinforce racial biases or stereotypes.
Exactly. CRT allows us to unpack those narratives and challenge those dominant perspectives that often go unquestioned.
This is all so fascinating. It feels like we're peeling back layers of meaning and uncovering those hidden power dynamics that shape our world.
I'm glad you're finding it insightful. And that's just a small sampling of the many ways that CRT is being used in discourse analysis. From media studies to healthcare to environmental justice, researchers are applying this framework to understand how language shapes our understanding of race and its impact on a wide range of social issues.
Wow, this is really opening my eyes to the incredible scope of this field. We've covered so much ground, but we haven't talked about those other methodologies you mentioned earlier, the ones beyond CDA and ethnography of communication.
You're right. There's a whole toolbox of methods that we haven't even touched on yet. But I think it's time we move on to part 3 of our deep dive.
I'm ready. Lead the way.
Right.
Okay, so we've explored a ton of ground already, from the basic principles of critical race theory to some of the powerful methods used in discourse analysis. But you mentioned there were even more methodologies to uncover.
There are. And each one offers a unique lens for understanding how language shapes our perceptions of race and influences those dynamics of power. Remember how we talked about intersectionality earlier? Well, some of these methodologies build on that concept by focusing on the specific experiences of different groups.
You mean like how race intersects with disability or ethnicity?
Exactly. One of these is distorted or disability critical race theory, and it examines how systems of oppression related to both race and disability are intertwined.
Okay.
So it challenges those dominant narratives that often exclude or marginalize people with disabilities, particularly those from racialized groups.
So it's not just about looking at disability or race in isolation, but understanding how those two forces work together to shape people's lives.
Precisely. Imagine you're analyzing educational materials through a discrete lens, you might ask. How are students with disabilities, especially those from minority backgrounds, represented in these texts? Are their stories and experiences included in meaningful ways? Or are they erased or stereotyped?
Wow, that's a powerful question. It makes you realize how those subtle forms of exclusion can perpetuate inequality from a very young age.
Absolutely. And discrete can be applied to any form of discourse. Think about how media portrays people with disabilities, or how workplaces accommodate their needs. Are those representations inclusive and equitable? Or do they reinforce negative stereotypes and limitations?
It's like holding a magnifying glass up to those power dynamics that often go unnoticed. So discrit focuses on disability, but what about other intersections?
There are frameworks for that too. LatCrit, for example, examines the experiences of Latinx communities through a critical race lens.
Okay, tell me more about LADCRIT. The articles mention how it goes beyond the traditional black-white paradigm of race relations in the U.S.
Exactly. So LatCrit explores issues like immigration language rights and cultural representation that are specific to Latinx communities. It challenges those dominant narratives that often stereotype or essentialize those experiences.
You know, it makes me think about the current debates around immigration. A LADCRIT analysis could reveal how certain language is used to dehumanize or demonize Latinx immigrants, justifying those discriminatory policies.
Absolutely. By applying a LatCrit lens, we can expose those harmful power dynamics and challenge the ways in which those narratives shape public perception and policy decisions. It's about recognizing the diversity and complexity of Latinx experiences and advocating for their full inclusion and representation.
This is so insightful. It feels like we're expanding our understanding of race and how it intersects with so many other aspects of identity.
And then there's still more. Asian Crit offers a similar framework for understanding the unique forms of racism and stereotyping that impact Asian American and Pacific Islander communities.
I remember the articles talked about the model minority myth and how damaging that can be.
Exactly. That myth portrays Asians as successful and high-achieving, which might sound positive on the surface, but it actually creates a lot of harm. It pits Asian Americans against other minority groups, ignores the struggles that many within the community face, and puts immense pressure on individuals to conform to these unrealistic expectations.
It's like saying, look, this group is doing well, so why can't everyone else? Which completely ignores the systemic barriers and historical injustices that other groups continue to face.
Precisely. Asian Crit helps us deconstruct those harmful stereotypes and reveal how they contribute to a system of racial hierarchy that ultimately benefits white supremacy.
This is all so crucial. We're seeing how these different frameworks can uncover those hidden biases and challenge those dominant narratives that perpetuate inequality.
Is there another framework we should touch on?
There's one more that's vital to understanding the complexities of race in the U.S. Tribal Crit, which focuses on the experiences of indigenous peoples.
I'm ready to learn about Tribal Crit. So Tribal Crit centers on the historical and ongoing legacy of colonialism and its devastating impact on Native American and indigenous communities. It examines issues related to sovereignty, self-determination, cultural preservation, and the struggle for recognition and justice.
It's a stark reminder that racism isn't just a historical phenomenon. It continues to impact indigenous communities in profound ways.
Exactly. Tribal Crit challenges us to listen to those often silenced voices, to understand the complexities of indigenous identities and histories, and to dismantle those colonial structures that perpetuate injustice.
Wow, this deep dive has been a whirlwind of information and insights. I feel like I've gained a whole new vocabulary for understanding how language shapes our world and how race operates in our society.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's been a pleasure exploring these concepts with you.
You've been an incredible guide. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important takeaway is that language is never neutral. It's a powerful tool that can be used to perpetuate or to dismantle systems of oppression. So I encourage everyone to pay attention to the language they use and encounter, to question those dominant narratives, and to use their voices to advocate for a more just and equitable world.
That's a powerful message to end on. To all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into critical race theory and discourse analysis. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep using your voices to create positive change.
Until next time.